I have seen a lot in my 40 years on this bench. I have watched the rich walk in like they own the room. I have watched the powerful try to use their title as a shield. But what walked into my courtroom on the morning of November 14th at exactly 10:30 a.m. was something I had never seen before. A 32-year-old man who shoved a 71-year-old Vietnam veteran to the ground in broad daylight and then stood before me, arms crossed, with a smirk on his face that told me he expected to walk right back out. And somewhere in the back of that courtroom, sitting in civilian clothes, was his father, a man with a badge, a reputation, and 35 years of service. And what that father did next made the entire courtroom go completely silent. If you think you know how this ends, trust me, you don't. Hit that subscribe button right now because this story is going to change the way you think about power, privilege, and what real love actually looks like. The case file in front of me seemed explosive enough on the surface. My clerk had handed it to me that morning with a look I recognized. The look she gets when a case has already made the local news before it reaches my bench. I read it twice before I even put on my robe. State versus Marcus Holt, case number 2024-CR4417, assault and battery on an elderly person. The defendant was Marcus Holt, age 32. The victim was James Calloway, age 71, a Vietnam veteran, a retired school teacher, a grandfather of 4, a man who had spent 2 tours in the Mekong Delta so that people like Marcus Holt could live in a country where the law is supposed to mean something. Let me tell you about James Calloway before I tell you about what happened that morning in the park. Because in cases like this, it matters who the victim is. Not because some victims deserve more justice than others. Every human being deserves equal protection under the law. But because the full weight of what was done to James Calloway cannot be understood without understanding the life that was risked. James enlisted in 1971 at 18 years old. He served with the 101st Airborne Division, 2 full tours, came home with a Purple Heart and a limp in his left leg that never went away. After the military, he spent 30 years teaching high school history in a public school in the same city where he grew up. He coached baseball on weekends. He volunteered at the Veterans Support Center on Tuesdays. He walked his dog, an old golden retriever named Sergeant, through Riverside Park every single morning at 8:15. That was his routine, his peace, his corner of the world. On November 11th, Veterans Day, Marcus Holt was driving his black Mercedes through the Park Road at over 50 miles per hour in a 15-mile-per-hour zone. Sergeant pulled toward the road. James stepped to the curb and raised his hand, the universal signal. Slow down. Just slow down. Marcus didn't slow down. He stopped. He put the car in park, stepped out onto the pavement, walked straight to James Calloway, and shoved that 71-year-old man so hard he hit the ground and didn't get back up on his own. James suffered a fractured wrist, 2 bruised ribs, and a severe concussion. He spent 3 nights in the hospital. When the paramedics arrived, he was still on the ground, trying to sit up, too proud to stay flat on his back in public. 3 witnesses called 911. All 3 gave the same account. Marcus Holt stood over James on the ground and said, and I want you to hear these exact words, "Next time, old man, keep your hands to yourself. My father runs this city. You have no idea who you just messed with." Then he got back in his Mercedes and drove away. Now, before I tell you what Marcus Holt looked like when he walked into my courtroom, before I tell you what he said when he opened his mouth, and what happened when his arrogance finally met something it couldn't move, I want you to do something. Drop a comment right now and tell me, have you ever witnessed someone use their family's name to escape accountability? Have you ever stood by and watched power protect itself? Tell me, because what you're about to see is the answer to that question, and it's not what you'd expect. And while you're down there, subscribe to this channel Less than 5% of people watching are subscribed. If you believe that badges should mean responsibility and not immunity, hit that button right now. You are going to want to see what happens next. Marcus Holt walked into my courtroom like the room belonged to him. Expensive charcoal suit, a watch that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. His attorney, a private defense lawyer, who I'd seen maneuver wealthy clients out of tight corners before, walked half a step behind him like a well-trained shadow. The attorney carried a leather portfolio thick enough to suggest his client was prepared to argue everything, dispute everything, and outlast everything through paperwork and procedure. That's the strategy when the facts aren't on your side. Marcus didn't look nervous. He looked inconvenienced. The way someone looks when they've been called into a meeting they didn't want to attend. He glanced around the courtroom with a mild interest, like he was assessing whether any of it was worth his time. He didn't look at James Calloway, not once. James was sitting in the front row of the gallery in his dress clothes. His wrist was still in a brace. His Purple Heart was pinned to his lapel. And Marcus Holt, the man who put him on the ground on Veterans Day, couldn't even look in his direction. That told me everything. I called the case. Marcus stood. His attorney stood beside him. And when I asked Marcus how he pleaded, his attorney jumped in immediately. Not guilty, Your Honor. We believe the evidence is circumstantial and the witnesses are inconsistent. I looked at Marcus directly. Mr. Holt, I asked you, do you have a voice? He looked at me with that smirk still in place. Not guilty. Thank you, I said. Now let's talk about what happened on November 11th. I asked the officer to present the evidence. Officer Patricia Ewan, badge number 2218, walked the court through the timeline with the precision of someone who had done this many times. She presented the 911 call logs, the witness statements, the medical report from the hospital, and then, the moment Marcus's attorney shifted in his seat, she presented the parking lot security footage from the recreational center adjacent to the park. Crystal clear, full color, timestamp on screen. We played it on the courtroom monitor. The entire gallery watched in silence as Marcus Holt's Mercedes appeared on screen, moving at a speed that was visibly absurd for that road. James Calloway raising his hand. Marcus stopping, stepping out, walking directly toward James with his shoulders set and his jaw hard. The shove that sent a 71-year-old man, a decorated veteran with a bad leg, straight to the ground. Marcus standing over him, gesturing, getting back in his car, and leaving. The courtroom was silent for a full 3 seconds after the footage ended. Not the restless silence of boredom, the held-breath silence of people who have just watched something they cannot unhear. I looked at Marcus. Still not guilty, Mr. Holt? He shrugged, actually shrugged, and said, he stepped into the road. I reacted. The gallery exhaled. Someone behind me murmured something I chose not to acknowledge. James Calloway sat perfectly still, the way men from that generation sit when they've learned that composure is its own kind of power. I leaned forward. I said, Mr. Holt, I've been on this bench for 4 decades. I have seen defendants lie with extraordinary creativity. What I just watched on that screen was not a reaction. That was a decision. You put your car in park. You walked toward a 71-year-old man. You made a choice. So I'm going to ask you again. Would you like to reconsider your characterization of what happened on Veterans Day? His attorney put a hand on his arm. Marcus pulled his arm away. And then he said something that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Your Honor, he said, voice steady and calm, like he was explaining something obvious to someone slow. My father has served this city for 35 years. He's the chief of police. I think it's fair to say I understand law enforcement, and I understand what constitutes an actual threat. That old man was in the road. I protected myself, and I moved on. The fact that I'm even here is an embarrassment. The gallery didn't gasp. It went quiet in a way that's louder than gasping. I removed my glasses. Anyone who knows me knows what that means. An embarrassment, I repeated. Mr. Holt, do you know who James Calloway is? He glanced at James for the first time. A single dismissive look. No. I stood up from the bench. I walked down to the front. James Calloway, I said, would you please stand? He stood slowly, with the care of a man who has learned not to trust his joints. He stood straight. He looked at me and waited. Mr. Calloway, I said, would you please tell the court who you are? James Calloway cleared his throat. His voice was quiet, but it carried. My name is James Calloway. I served in the United States Army, 101st Airborne Division, from 1971 to 1973. 2 tours in Vietnam. Purple Heart. I taught history at Jefferson High for 30 years. I have 4 grandchildren. I walk my dog in that park every morning because it's the only hour I have to myself since my wife passed 2 years ago. He paused. And on Veterans Day, I asked a man to slow down near the road because I didn't want my dog to get hit, and he put me on the ground. The courtroom was absolutely still. I turned back to Marcus Holt. Do you understand what you just heard? You shoved a decorated combat veteran, a man who risked his life for this country, a man who spent 3 decades teaching children, a man who was walking his dog on Veterans Day, and you put him on the ground and called it a reaction. I looked at him for a long moment. You are 32 years old. You should be ashamed of yourself. Marcus's smirk finally slipped. His jaw tightened. His attorney was leaning toward him, whispering, but Marcus leaned away from him instead and looked straight at me. Your Honor, he said, my father will be speaking with the district attorney's office about this case. I think you should be aware of that. And there it was. The reason this case ended up on the news. The reason this courtroom is the one you're watching right now. I said, Mr. Holt, are you attempting to tell me that your father's position will influence how I conduct this hearing? He held my gaze. I'm just saying, he knows people. I looked out at the gallery. Chief Holt, I said, would you please come forward? The entire room turned around. In the last row, a man stood up, late 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a plain button-down shirt and slacks. No uniform, no badge. Chief Raymond Holt had been sitting there from the beginning. He'd heard every word his son said. He'd watched the footage. He'd sat through the dismissal of James Calloway's service. And the look on his face when he walked down that center aisle was not anger. It was something worse. It was grief. Marcus turned around slowly. His face went through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. Confusion, relief, then something close to fear when he read his father's face. Dad, he said, what are you? Chief Holt held up one hand, and Marcus stopped talking immediately. I said, Chief Holt, thank you for being here. I understand this is not easy. I paused. Your son has told this court on multiple occasions that your position and your relationships will influence the outcome of this case. I'd like to give you an opportunity to speak to that directly. Chief Raymond Holt stood at attention.
True character is revealed not by power or privilege,
but I could hear what it
but
was
by taking responsibility for your actions and choosing justice over personal interest.
He has always been wrong about that.
Key lessons.
I have spent 35
Power
years
and
serving
family
this city.
status should never be used to escape justice.
Who wore the same badge
True leadership
I wear.
means doing what is right,
even
when it hurts your own family.
No one,
Respect every person, especially the elderly and those who have served others. Real strength is shown through humility, accountability, and sincere repentance.
Marcus opened his mouth.
Forgiveness and justice can work together to transform lives.
It worked.